So this is the second half of our geographic features videos. We have land features. There's 18 of those. You can check that video out separately. This one, there's about 12 water features that we're going to cover. Some of them are really basic and you've heard them forever, and some are pretty new. And again, all of them you can use for your cartography project, and we'll see them over the course of the year as well. So the first one there is ocean. When I was growing up, there were 4 oceans, and now there are 5 oceans. We did not gain more water somehow. We just divide them a little bit differently now. So the ones that we'll talk about this year are mostly the Atlantic and the Pacific, which we'll get to in just a moment. The Arctic also touches the United States. The U.S. does not touch the Indian Ocean and the Southern Ocean. The Southern one is the new one, by the way. That was not an ocean when I was a kid. Right below that, I have Gulf and Bay and Sound, and I put all those together because they're all parts of an ocean. They can sometimes be a lake, sometimes a bay, occasionally a sound will be part of a lake, but usually it's part of an ocean. A gulf is usually a very large body of water that's a section of an ocean. You'll sometimes see the word sea, S-E-A, like the Mediterranean Sea or the Caribbean Sea. Those are also parts of oceans. They're going to be salt water if they're oceans. If it is a bay or a sound that's part of a lake, it's going to be fresh water. And in this case, sound is not like the sound that you hear with your ear. It's a body of salt water. And some of the more famous ones are the Long Island Sound, which I grew up pretty close to up in New York, and then Block Island Sound, which is not too far from the Long Island Sound, so it must be like a northeastern thing. You don't see sound all that often. You see bay a lot, and you'll see Gulf a couple times this year. The Gulf of Mexico and the Gulf of California being the 2 biggest ones. A strait is a kind of a skinny body of water that connects to really big bodies of water. So if you have an ocean on one side and a bay on the other, and then there's land, and there's a narrow body of water that connects the ocean to that bay, that's going to be a strait. We don't see them very often in the United States. There's a couple of ones we'll discuss when we get out to the western part of the country. And the one right below where it says strait, that's pronounced fjord. It's kind of like a strait. It goes in between cliffs. You mostly find them in the northern parts of Europe. I don't know if there's any of them in the United States. I include it mostly because it's a lot of fun to say, fjord. Then we get into some of our freshwater bodies of water. We start with lake, which again is one I'm pretty sure we know. A lake is pretty much the exact opposite of an island, because a lake is a body of water that is completely surrounded by land. There is one exception to that whole freshwater thing that I can think of in the United States. That'd be the Great Salt Lake, which is in Utah, which, as the name suggests, is salt. It's actually very, very salty. But most lakes, the vast majority of the lakes in the country, are going to be freshwater lakes. There's about 12,000 of them in Minnesota alone. A reservoir is any lake that is being used to store drinking water or water for people to use in their homes. Sometimes it's just a regular lake that was created by nature. In certain dry areas of the country, they will dig out a lake and actually use river water to fill it up, and then they will use that reservoir to save water for a certain period of time in case it gets really, really dry. If you look at the word reservoir, and I'll see if I can draw attention to it here, you can almost see the word reserve, and that's basically what they're doing. They're reserving the water for when they're going to need it. A harbor, I put it under lake, but it could also have gone under ocean. This is a place that's protected. It's a sheltered place along a coast where boats can be docked. The reason why it needs to be protected goes back hundreds of years, because the boats that are going into harbors usually have thousands and millions of dollars worth of goods. And back in the days of pirates, you would want to try to capture one of those boats and take all the goods off of it and sell it and make money for yourself. So these harbors were protected by cannons and forts and stuff like that. And they're usually off of big bodies of water. Boston Harbor is a very famous one because that's where the tea was dumped over for the Boston Tea Party. Baltimore Harbor was very famous because of the fact that Fort McHenry is in that harbor, and that's where the Star-Spangled Banner was written. And New York Harbor is very famous because there's a giant statue of a green lady with a torch there. But it's basically where goods are dropped off. And then rivers, and there's thousands of rivers over the country. We know what those are, I'm pretty sure. These are streams of water that flow across the land, and they will empty into another body of water. So rivers have a starting place and an ending place. Some rivers start at lakes. Some will kind of branch off of other rivers. Usually they're starting from lakes though, and usually they're starting in areas of high elevation, mountains and hills, and gravity kind of takes them down, and then they start flowing. A lot of rivers will end in really big bodies of water, in some cases oceans, in some cases gulfs, in some cases lakes. In most cases, rivers end at other rivers. They just combine with other rivers that are bigger. So the Mississippi River, which is one we'll see in the map in just a second, has hundreds and thousands of different rivers that are flowing into it, and that's what makes the Mississippi so big and so important. The place where the river starts is called its source. So it's easy to remember because source and starts both start with S, and that's where the river is going to begin. And then wherever the river ends is its mouth, and that's also kind of easy to remember in a disgusting way, because if you pictured the river being spit into a larger body of water, that's the mouth. And then last but not least, I put these two together because I'm never really certain where to put them, if they're land features or if they're water features, but I have swamp and marsh. A swamp it's land, but it's completely covered by water sometimes. Other times when it's been a little bit drier, there might not be any water there. It'll still be kind of moist and gross and, well, swampy. But it's usually covered by water, but it doesn't always have to be. A marsh is kind of like a swamp, except usually a marsh is close to salt water. So you'll see marshes in lowlands that are pretty close to an ocean or a bay or a gulf. Think Florida. They're kind of swampy, but usually with brackish water as opposed to fresh water. So now we'll take a look and see what these things look like on a map by pointing out some of the more important ones that are in the United States. So we'll start off with the ocean that is to the east of the United States, and that's the Atlantic Ocean, which I think we know very well. And if we are moving west across the ocean towards the United States, we're going to focus on a couple of rivers that are very, very important to the development of the United States. So I'm going to zoom in, and we're going to start off with one that was actually nicknamed the Gateway to the West, and it's the Ohio River, which I'm kind of circling with the little hand tool here. The Ohio River actually gets a start in Pennsylvania. It flows up into New York for a little bit, and then it comes down. It actually goes through Pittsburgh. If you've ever seen a Pittsburgh Pirates game or a Pittsburgh Steelers game, the river that's right on the other side of their stadiums is the Ohio River, where it kind of combines with two other rivers. So it's going to flow all the way down here past Ohio. Obviously that's where it gets its name. Divides Ohio and West Virginia, divides Ohio and Kentucky. It divides Kentucky and Indiana, and it eventually divides Kentucky and Illinois, and then it combines with the Mississippi River right about here. So the Ohio actually flows into the Mississippi. The term for that is a tributary, and that means when a smaller river is flowing into a larger river, but we'll get to that more later on. So the Ohio is a very important one. Probably the most important one is the one that's right here, and that's the Mississippi. So the Mississippi gets its start at a very small lake up here near a place in Minnesota called Bemidji, which is also a lot of fun to say. The lake is called Lake Itasca, and it kind of hooks around and comes down through Minnesota. It goes through Minneapolis and St. Paul, which we call the Twin Cities, which is why the baseball team is called the Minnesota Twins. And it flows down, it forms the border between Minnesota and Wisconsin. It flows down here. It makes the border between Wisconsin and Iowa. It gives Iowa its kind of nose shape. That's how I remember Iowa, because it has a nose. And then we scroll down, and it forms the border between Iowa and Illinois, between Illinois and Missouri, and there's St. Louis. And it keeps flowing down, forms the border between Missouri and Kentucky, between Tennessee and Missouri, between Tennessee and Arkansas. There it is again. Before it finally reaches the state that is named after it, and that's the state of Mississippi. And then eventually goes down through Louisiana and goes through New Orleans into the Gulf of Mexico, another very important body of water that connects a lot of the southern part of the United States to the rest of the world. So that's the Mississippi and the Gulf, and those are closely connected. Another really big river, I'm going to scroll up just a little bit, that gets its start all the way here in Montana. It's actually longer than the Mississippi, and it eventually combines with the Mississippi. Um, but once they combine, they call it the Mississippi because it keeps going the same direction as the Mississippi River. But it gets to start all the way over here in Wyoming. It goes through the Rocky Mountains. Gravity kind of takes it past a place called Helena, through a place called Great Falls, all the way through Montana, which is a really big state. Flows through a couple of lakes in North Dakota, goes down south through the capital, which is Bismarck, goes down through South Dakota through their capital, which is called Pierre, forms the border between South Dakota and Nebraska, between Nebraska and Iowa, goes right past Omaha. Thank you, Peyton Manning. Goes down and forms the border between Kansas and Missouri. It goes across Missouri, and then it combines with the Mississippi right at St. Louis. This is why St. Louis is so important, because the two biggest rivers in the country meet at St. Louis. If I continue, I'm going to go north a little bit. I'm going to get off of rivers for just a second, and we're going to take a look at the Great Lakes. They call them great because they're so awesome, but also because they're so big. An easy way to remember them, if you remember the acronym HOMES, you have HOMES, H for Huron, O for Ontario, M for Michigan, E for Erie, and then S, I had to go up a little bit, for Superior. Now, Lake Superior is the biggest one. These are hugely important bodies of water, and we'll talk about some of the big cities that can be found in them, like Chicago, Milwaukee, Green Bay, which is most famous for football, but also has a lot of meat packing and shipping and stuff like that. Cleveland, Toledo, the Canadian city of Toronto, Buffalo. These are all big cities that are located on the Great Lakes. So we're going to continue moving west and just to get a couple more rivers. I'm actually going to go south first, south and west. I'm going to go down to Texas, and I'm actually going to start in Colorado. There's a river that gets started here in the Rocky Mountains, comes down south through New Mexico, and then goes to a city called El Paso in Texas. It's called the Rio Grande, which is a Spanish word that means big river, a Spanish term, I should say. It's two words. And it's an important river because, first of all, it's big, as the name would suggest, but it also divides the United States from Mexico. So down here is Mexico, up there is the United States, this is Texas, and it eventually dumps into the mouth, which is at the Gulf of Mexico. So the mouth of the Rio Grande is the Gulf of Mexico. I'm going to go up, back into Colorado, and if we look right here in Colorado, there's a river that starts in the Rocky Mountains again. This one heads west. It goes down through Colorado into Utah. It forms a lake called Lake Powell, which is named after a guy named John Wesley Powell. John Wesley Powell became famous because he went exploring through the Grand Canyon. This river actually carves the Grand Canyon. I'm going to scroll in just a little bit so we can see the name of the river. It's got to be here somewhere. Here it is. This is the Colorado River. And it goes down again through the Grand Canyon. It is great too, but it's the Grand Canyon. Goes into Lake Mead, which is actually made, it's a human-made lake, down to a lake called Lake Mojave. Goes to a lake called Lake Havasu. It eventually dumps into a gulf called the Gulf of California. It also goes through Mexico. I'm going to go a little further north. Actually, a lot further north. That's a lie. And this river right here, which is called the Columbia, starts, wow, it's a lot further north. Holy cow, I was way off. Wow. Okay, so it starts in a place called Kinbasket Lake, which is, I'm going to scroll back just a little bit, located in Canada. So yeah, a little further north. And it's going to go down through Canada. It's going to go into the state of Washington through a lake called Franklin D. Roosevelt Lake. It's going to come down and mix with a river called the Snake River. And then it eventually forms the border between Washington and Oregon before it dumps into the Pacific Ocean. And that was an important river, the Columbia River, because this was the river that took Lewis and Clark to the Pacific. And that's the last body of water that we're going to close with. Let me scroll out. Where is it? Here we go, the Pacific Ocean, which is on the west coast of the United States. Really quickly, I'll just scroll back and I'll show you, because Alaska does touch the Arctic Ocean, which is up here. We're not going to talk about that very much because it only really touches Alaska. So those are the really important water features in the United States. And again, you can use any of this to help you with your cartography project, and we'll talk to them throughout the year.